All right, let's get started. So, how many design principles are there? We're going to talk about the principles of design today. Well, it depends on where you look or who you ask. There's alignment, hierarchy, contrast, repetition, proximity, balance, color, space, scale, pattern, emphasis, unity, similarity, uniform density, direction, closure, regions, objective, past experience, field, and simplicity. So there's many different design principles, and it can be dependent on the type of industry and design you are, if it's graphic design, industrial design, architecture design, how many principles are used for each different project or different discipline within. We're going to talk about the top 7, and that is, we're going to talk about hierarchy, alignment, repetition, contrast, simplicity, balance, and proximity. I added 2 more slides and now I realized I didn't animate them like I did everything else. Sorry, less fancy. All right, so let's start with number 1. And it's going to be hierarchy. So hierarchy is one of the most critical principles of design. Like the term implies, without establishing hierarchy, it's likely that individuals looking at design will consider each element equally important. So you can establish hierarchy of these elements by manipulating any of the 3 factors. Start with size. People will pay attention to the biggest elements of a composition first, since it signals importance. So here you can see examples of big heads. So we're looking at size, and these 2 posters are similar in their hierarchy because they're both having these big heads. We have color. So you can see in this design, whenever you want something to stand out, color comes in handy. Contrasting colors for important text and icons will help them get noticed. So here's a website, and you can see that the important information they really want you to pay attention to, they have highlighted in yellow. They've also made their buttons in yellow and any links in yellow so that you know what yellow is what you should be paying attention to. And then you have position. An element's position within a design says a lot about its level of importance. So for example, here you have 2 designs by Paula Scher, and the title of each one of these theater posters is showing us by position its importance. So the woman screaming out the name of the show is the importance. And then on the second one, the play called Him is just hair, and right where the eyes are supposed to be, you see the word him. So it really catches our attention, makes us pay attention to it first in both cases. All right, moving on to alignment. We have left, right, top, bottom, and center alignment. Alignment is an important principle of design. It helps create a sharp, ordered appearance. Ultimately, better designs by ensuring various elements have a pleasing connection with each other. Center, right, or left aligned text is the most common, but you can also align text to other objects within your graphics. Edge alignment is the placement of design along the edges of any composition. There are 4 types of edge alignments: left aligned, right aligned, top aligned, and bottom aligned. Horizontally, center aligned places elements along the central y-axis, and vertically center aligned places objects along the x-axis. Systems pervade graphic design. A grid system of irrelated character styles and spaces. A grid system of columns, rows, and margins Each one addresses spatial relationships among visual elements. In the 60s and 70s, Massimo Vignelli, influential posters and information system, employed horizontal grid lines and visual structural elements like you see in these examples here. So not only did he use a grid and was a very strong proponent of grids, he implemented them into the actual design by taking the gutters of the rows and actually filling them in with black. So you can see these strong, heavy black stripes going through horizontally. That's part of the grid system. And then vertically, you can see the type all in columns. So it's almost making this very checkerboard element within. Here you have an example of vertical alignment. For the 10th Gwangju biennial poster, the designers created a typographic system featuring 3 different weights with 5 different line breaks. Used together, the system allowed the design to cover as much surface area of the poster with as much text as possible. For the Now Jump poster, the designers noticed the featured artist's initials were within the title, so they highlighted them using a different font. The overall poster has a tight alignment, and a break from the grid allows the featured artist names to be called out. Repetition. Repetition is the recurrence of design elements, commonly utilized in patterns and textures. Repetitive elements can be used in conjunction with other principles to create a design that leads a user's eye to a focal point and has continuality, a flow. A repetitive element could be repeated lines, shapes, forms, colors, or even design elements. Here we have designers Dietmar Winkler, who is using the complexities of COBOL, which is a programming language which was inviting simplicity. And this was done back in 1969. And the idea here was to use repeating geometric shapes to create a puzzle for the viewer to solve. They were all interconnected to build a title of the poster, as COBOL does in a programming language. So I was trying to repeat what the language that they were communicating does. And this was done back in 1969. It looks so contemporary for today. And then next door, 50 years later, Hampton Dunlap's proposal for the 2028 Olympics in LA uses a system also repeating geometric forms to create the title of the poster. And this is built off of the Olympic rings. But it's interesting to see the similarities. And this is like these 2 posters were made 50 years apart from each other. Here's contrast. We look at contrast is the difference between 2 or more objects in a design is referred to as contrast. The difference in objects could be light and dark. It could be thick and thin, small and large, bright and dull. It could be contrast in shape, in color, in scale, and in layout. Contrast is most commonly associated with readability and accessibility. Like hierarchy, the most important elements in a design should have the most contrast. The bright blue button on a stark white background with lots of white space is considered high contrast. If the button was almost the same color as the background, with maybe a 1 pixel stroke versus a fill, it would have less contrast. A text-based design could be high contrast by using black text on a white background, and it could be low contrast if it was black text on a gray background. Emory Douglas uses color contrast and scale expertly to communicate what he wants the viewer to pay attention to in his images for the Black Panther newspaper. Here you can see this is a newspaper and they have 1 color they're using at a time. So the important things that they really want us to pay attention to, they're using color and using that to highlight the important part of the message. The rest of the illustration is done in black and white. Here we have both scale and layout in designer Eamon Hoffman's piece from 1960. Scale is relative. An object or image is only as big or as small in relation to what surrounds it. Designers use scale to change how things look and what they mean, activating our process of vision, as well as our ability to read and interpret pictures as a narrative medium. Here we have the Swiss poster with both shape and scale of the letter forms graduating as they go across the page. We start with this very bubbly, bold letter forms on the left, and they're slowly changing to very skinny, thin letters on the right. This is using not only shape, but also scale to adjust and affect the contrast of the piece. Moving on to simplicity, number 5. Simplicity is the discipline of minimizing, refining, or editing back a design. Well, you all know simplicity because that's what we did for our project too. So you all, at this point, I'm guessing, are experts in simplicity. You know that keeping it simple can work really well. In general, less is more, and less is more striking. We consider simplicity to ensure a piece of communication has maximum clarity. We consider simplicity to create balance and impact. And simple design is easier to understand and more likely to make a lasting impression. Let's look at a few examples. Here we have John Macy and Tom Wan right here in Chicago doing work for Herman Miller in the 1970s. This was John Macy, who was based in Chicago, was a leading practitioner in modernism for corporate applications, as well as an influential educator. The poster for Herman Miller Furniture Company applies Hoffman's concept of graphic translation to interpret a piece of modernist furniture as an abstract icon. The poster includes no concrete information about the furniture. So this one on the left with the black and white is implying a piece of modernist furniture. Now, I don't know about you, but it doesn't really look like anything to me that resembles furniture. But that's really not the point. The point was to give you a feel of what that furniture might feel like. So I think we can imply from looking at the soft curves and flowy elements that they put together that this is going to be something soft and fluid feeling and experiencing without actually seeing a piece of furniture specifically. And then on the right, Malcolm Greer, a leading designer and educator at RISD in the Rhode Island School of Design, designed this poster for the Guggenheim Museum. Its one color was designed to be overprint with information for different events. So they designed this poster, which is based on the architecture of the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And it's very simple design, allows it to have things printed on top of it with highlighting special events and things that would be coming up. Designer Albert Exergen created this series of posters to represent his generation's response to the legacy of Swiss modernism. Albert plays with the idea of using reductive imagery to unlock the essence of complex subjects. And his subjects, of course, are American television shows. So he's taken and decided how simplified he can communicate the meaning of the various television shows. I'm sure some of these might be familiar to you. All right, moving on to number 6, balance. Balance. Our objects in design carry weight just like the physical world, but it's called visual weight. Visual weight of a design needs to have balance, like putting 2 objects on a seesaw. If one side is too heavy, the viewer's eyes go directly to the heavy part. If it's weighted with all things equal, the seesaw is perfectly suspended without either side touching the ground. Balance can be implied by size, shape, or even contrast. While it can utilize symmetry or equality, balance can also be achieved through asymmetrical designs. For example, 3 or small objects can offset the visual weight of a large object, or a dark, small, shaded object can offset the visual of a white, larger, lighter element. Let's look at some examples. Here we have an example of a symmetrical design. Here's the Titanic poster by designer Doreen Austria. And this is a quintessential example of a very symmetrical design. It is purely mirroring each other. Even, the heads have the same space on the top. The boat is, of course, very symmetrical, and it's very powerful to have this very symmetrical design. And here's a painting by Gerrit von Hansthorst. Hansthorst? I think that's how you pronounce it. The artist creates balance by using heavily contrasting darks and lights. So this is the idea of asymmetrical balance, achieving through contrast, elements of equal or equal weights, rather than creating an identical mirrored image. Here you have several smaller elements that will balance out one object. Another type of symmetry or balance is radial. Radial balance designs feature images and design elements emitting from a single focal point, almost like the spokes on a wheel. The radial balance creates a strong focal point wherever your spokes converge. For, of course, on this, it's the pupil of the eye is what's pulling us all in on this radial balance. Here's another example. And here's one with an actual like polar grid printed right on top of the imagery. And then you can see the type kind of coming off the different radial elements within the radial grid. And lastly, our last one we're going to talk about today is proximity. Hold on, I didn't tell you what it was, sorry. Place-related elements near each other. Proximity is one of the most important grouping principles and can overpower competing visual clues such as similarity of color or shape. Practice of placing related elements close together and separating unrelated objects can be seen almost everywhere in design. White space separates the shapes in two distinct groups, going through principles of proximity. So even though the shapes might be different in each of these groups, the fact that we can see two groups is because we're using white space between them. Let's look at some examples. So proximity grouping abstract. In this example, you can see one group of circles on the left, and on the right, you can see three groups of circles. The only thing that's changed between the left and the right is we've added space between two rows or columns, I should say, so that we've broken it into what looks now like three columns on the right, whereas it was just one big block on the left. It's the same amount of dots, but now we see one and we see three. That's proximity. Let's look at another way. Here, some of the rows have color, and it's so the example here is showing the principle of proximity is stronger than other Gestalt principles. You can see that the circles still appear grouped, even though we've added color to some of the circles. We still see two groups to the left and two groups to the right. It's stronger than the principle of similarity. Similarity would mean we would group all the red ones together and all the black ones together. But we don't do that. We visually see rows, we still see columns happening and not color, not grouped by color. And lastly, proximity defines direction. So here you can see the ones on the left feel like they are columns, vertical, and the ones on the right are rows, horizontal. And that is because the proximity of the item, so the way we've added the space in between the dots, affects the way we read them. Let's look at it in action. People use this to organize all kinds of different information. We see it a lot in UX design and on websites. So for example, the things that you want to use in UX design is notice how the products are organized. Their name and price and buttons are all placed together in a group so that you have one grouping where you know you're going to get that information and click a button. Down below, you can see they've created these cards where all of the information for each different feature is grouped together so that we know that that's a set, and we call them like cards in UX. Let's look at another one. Here we have you can arrange your elements so that the certain part stands out by simply using the proximity principle. So understanding that the way we're positioning information, like the superhero JS, is connected to the body copy, because we put those two together, that becomes a grouping in proximity, the headline and the body copy. Here we're looking at grouping of images and the way they're organized. So organized in columns, and the way they're spaced is giving us the reading of them, the direction they want us to read them, which is in columns. And lastly, again, we use proximity a lot in user experience design. So you can see everything from the little circles with the people's heads in them, the way they're organized in rows. You can see the images that the clicking are in columns. So grouping of elements and items happens a lot when we're dealing with UX design to have people navigate through any digital application. So we use proximity in those areas often. All right.